All right, everybody, let's give this a minute to get spooled up, and I'll get all my notes ready. Welcome back. It's been a week. Yeah, it's been great. Hopefully everybody had a nice week off. Was able to buy toilet paper for our American jokes. Today we're going to do part 2 of Karl Marx. And for those of you who haven't joined us, this is going over the introduction of Das Kapital, or as it's called in English, Capital. And of course, Volume 1, for any super Marx nerds out there, because Volume 2 and 3 were written by other people. So they're not, real books. No, but we're focusing on the core book. So, alright, so I'll give this a minute to make sure it's spooling up. It looks like it's on. Fantastic. Alright, let's jump right in. Oop. Wrong button. Bam. Boom. Good. All right. Get my laser pointer. And my laser pointer. Fantastic. All right. So, really quick note, too, for students. This will be online today. Let me find it. I'll put it up so you can see it, and then it'll be online today. This is the draft guidelines. Let's see if it shows up. Yeah. It's a little low res. That's not very nice. Let's zoom it in a little bit. The draft guidelines will be up online today, so I'm not going to go over it today. Take a look at it, and then we'll go over it on Thursday. But just so you know, you'll have the data of what I'm looking for the draft, and that'll be part of our Thursday, like how to write section, and like what I expect for the draft, and how to structure drafts for research papers. All right, so closing that for now. All right, so we're going to continue where we left off. So we finished with the purpose of capital, which is this book, right? So we're going to get into the meat of it today, the big three. Now, when I say the big three, what I mean is we're going to do the big three Marxist concepts. So what are the police are checking for people breaking quarantine again. Hooray. So we're going to focus on the fundamental core of what is this, right? Like what is Marx doing here? What's the structure of his thought system? Now, the most important structure of today we're going to do the big three basically, and I'm just looking for my notes. Oh, here we go. Yeah, Materialist Dialectic. So today we're going to do the Materialist Dialectic. Now, if you've never heard of it, you've been under a rock. No, it's a joke. But this is the core of not just Marxist thinking, but basically all secular, atheist, modernist thinking. Evolutionary thought, it's all materialist. It's this assumption is underneath it. So what do we mean by this? Well, a couple things we're going to notice here. I gotta get there we go. All right. So first, Materialist Dialectic is a couple things at the same time. The first thing it is a method of knowledge. So the reason this is the first thing you talk about when you talk about Marx, it's the foundation of how a Marxist says we know anything. Now, this is why these two words matter. Materialist means you believe things come from matter, right? So physical reality. And dialectic is an old Greek word that just means the search for truth. So, for a Marxist, and for any materialists, the materialist dialectic is the way you search for truth through matter. And we'll get into more what that means in a bit. So, here we go. So I'll read this and explain it. So for a Marxist, there's a holistic view of the economic systems that include contradictions, changes, reforms, then changes of the mode of production. Now, let me explain this. So, basically, Marxists believe that matter can give us truth. So understanding matter and material gives us truth. And then, how is this practical? Like, we're writing a research paper, right? Why would I talk about this? Well, they believe that economic systems are the material of any age. And we talked about this a little bit last time with the four systems. And then, these modes of production are why everything happens and where everything comes from. And it's how we can understand the truth of any age. So contradictions are just parts of a system that kind of don't work. Changes, right, things that change. Reforms, then changes to the mode of production. So Marxists are progressive thought. They always think things are generally improving, although we'll get to the end of that in a little bit. So now we get, where does this system come from? And even our introduction writer, let me find this, Marx was a student of a guy called Hegel. Now, if you don't know who Hegel is a German romantic. and Marx was a German too, by the way. But Hegel had something called the dialectic. He's the guy who kind of invented it. And the Hegelian dialectic is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And Hegel believes, here's my cursor, Hegel believed in an absolute idea. So he's much more Platonic, where he thought that reality is reflecting a metaphysical idea. So there's like an absolute idea behind reality moving it. Marx thought there was a process to history, but Marx is the opposite. He thought it was material, not like theoretical, ideological, or as Plato would say, intelligible. So we're arguing, is something like all mental or like non-physical, or something physical? So they're both kind of extremists in their own way, but Marx very much borrows the dialectic from Hegel. He just changes it from like a theory one to a material one. All right. Now, here we go. So for Marx, truth, the dialectic, and dialectic also means like the process of history, is materialist. And then ideal, this gives you a really good quote of how Marxists think of the world. Ideals, and the ideal, is nothing more than the material world reflected in the minds of men. So even for like theoretical things, a Marxist doesn't think the theoretical thing exists. They just think the theoretical thing is reflected in our brains, which is a physical thing. Does that make sense? So it's only a reflection of reality. It's not actually... doesn't exist outside of the minds of man. Does this make sense? Because a Hegelian or a Platonic thinker or an Aristotelian thinker or most religious people would say, no, the ideals exist free of us and we discover them. The Marxists would say, no, ideas are only reflections of the materialist reality. And again, they're being consistent. Why? Back up here. They think all reality and all truth and everything comes from matter. They don't think there's anything above matter. Again, if this doesn't sound evolutionary, I don't know what you're doing with your life. All right. So now, if you read this intro, which is available on the library, I have it for the e-reserve. The basic laws of motion of history are those of real men themselves producing their own material existence in a given social framework. So, like we talked about, there's this scientific... which last time I called pseudoscientific, but there's this scientific... they feel like they're doing physics of humans. So there's these laws of motion of man. This is what Marxists are trying to do, who themselves are producing their own material existence in a given social framework. So we can understand all human existence from real men and women, obviously, but men meaning human, right? Who are producing their own material existence. From the way we produce our material existence, you can understand both the social framework and the man. All right. Now, this is... even if you don't like Marxists, and regardless of how you feel about them, one reason Marxists can still do, we'll call it valid research for every field, is this one here. The foundation of materialist dialectic is empirical. Empirical is a school of British philosophy that is also half of Marxism. So half of Marxism is German idealism, and half is British empiricism. Empiricism is when we study John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is an empiricist. It's the idea that we can know reality from data and sense perception of reality. So by looking at reality, we can know it. So for a Marxist, a good Marxist, the dialectic has to be founded in data from material reality. And again, the Marxists are being consistent, because here, right? They think material reality is how we get to truth, and it's the only source of truth. So if that's true, then materialist dialectic has to be empirical. And they try to take nothing for granted or nothing as automatic. What this means is they try to question their assumptions. I say try, I'm not going to be too critical yet, but as we get to the end, I will break it down a little bit on that. They do also have their first principles and their assumptions, but they say they take nothing for granted, and I'll give the Marxists that, at least that's what they say. Any questions so far about what this is? This is the first pillar. So if you don't understand, it's a great time to ask me a question. Let's see if I missed anything too. I'm looking. Oh, I think I did good. Okay, yeah, somebody asked a great question. So matter is truth, ideal is material. Yes, so for a Marxist, the only truth is in the material matter world, and ideas are just reflections of that material world. there is no ideal world outside the material world? Yes, that's a great question, and you understood it. I think we might have one more question. I'll give the person a second to type it. Eventually I might get cool enough we do spoken questions. Here we go. So for the Marxist, history is determined by the will of the people. In rhetoric, yes, but in theory, no. So for a Marxist analyzing history, they don't think it's will. A Marxist would say the will of the people is determined by how they make their living. We'll get into it, but basically, they're determinists. They don't think there is a will of the people. I mean, they'll use words like will of the people, but actually they think even the people's will is determined by their material reality. So you don't determine your will, how you make your living determines your will. Yeah, it's tricky. And you got to separate with Marxists, like every other, to be fair to Marxists, right? With every other set of thought, you have to separate the rhetoric from the theory. Because the rhetoric's like what they tell people to support them, right? Because when I say like a Marxist, you think like somebody who's going to give you free stuff. But what is their end goal, or what's the theoretical reason they'd give you that stuff, right? That's what we're trying to figure out here. And that's how you'd use it as an analytical tool. All right. So method of capital, what's the kind of the structure or the purpose of this book? This one's we're going to pop through pretty quick, but I'll do it real quick. So first, commodity production is the basic cell of capitalism. So one big point of this book is analyzing capitalism as a material system. So what makes capitalism different from every other system is commodity production. And let me see my notes here. Yeah, an interesting part of this, when Marx starts his book, if you read chapter 1, Marx starts with commodities and not value. What does that mean? Commodity is the physical thing you've built, not the theoretical thing, which is like value. So a commodity, and by the way, the definition here, I keep forgetting to write it, but good thing I've read this book a couple times. A commodity is basically anything you make that you sell not to your immediate community. This is important for a Marxist definition, because modern Marxists and a lot of, I shouldn't say straw men of Marxists, but the author, this introduction writer, let me get his name right, Mandel, Professor Mandel would definitely say it is straw manning of their position. Because, for example, if you had a village with 200 people, and they had money, right? And they sold to each other everything everybody in the village needed. That isn't commodities. A commodity is like if I have a factory, and somebody said straw men of Marxists and then laughed. Yes, well, I mean, you can straw man any idea, right? That just means you put up a weak version of it and you beat up the weak version. So it happens at every school, but Marxists actually do it to themselves nowadays, which I find hilarious, just because nobody reads Marx. So it's pretty easy to do. So commodities are when you, say I had that village, but then it has a factory that makes 1 million pairs of shoes. Those shoes are commodities, because there's no way that one village will use all those shoes, right? I'm exporting them. So once the good becomes like a thing on a market where I'm trying to make capital, that's a commodity. All right, and keep going. This is interesting too. A kind of a Marxist view. And this, again, remember we talked about they're not really for ideals. So, for the dialectic for Marxists imply that everything has an origin and an end. Nothing is eternal or finished once and for all. So, for a Marxist thought, there is no settled science. Again, they're trying to have scientific mindset, right? Material scientific mindset. So nothing's settled, nothing's eternal, right? There is no ideals or principles that are free of the material reality, and then the material reality is always changing. So for a Marxist, there's no consistent standards. It's all depending on the means of production of the time, and we'll get into that in a minute too. All right, now. This is the translator's quote. Mandel says, for him, as a Marxist, he says there's a unity of historical and logical analysis. But what does he mean here? He's basically trying to say that what makes Marxism as a system good, right, is you have historical and logical analysis together. So they feel like they have more access to truth than traditional historians or traditional logisticians. Now, he then tries to say, and this of course is a little bit of my op-ed, I have to admit, that basically metaphysical systems are useless. This is what he basically says. But he has a metaphysics. But anyway, we'll get into that. Because metaphysics just means what's above physical reality. And Marxist says there's nothing above physical reality. But here's the thing. Saying there is nothing above physical reality is metaphysics. So anyway, so here we go. This is interesting too. So if you've ever heard people say like it's not real Marxism, Mandel makes a point here. Because he starts to get in some of the counter-arguments, which I'm skipping some of them because they're not necessarily helpful. For a Marxist, he points out Marx can be wrong in the short term and in the finite because he's right in the long term. This is basically, if you've ever heard a Marxist say not true Marxism, this is kind of the echo of that. I'm not saying that that is a good defense. This author would never say that. But it's the idea that Marx can be wrong. For Marxists, Marx can be wrong in the short term, but in the long term, his materialist dialectic is still correct. Like it's still diagnosing correctly, your time window is too small. All right, this one's not actually a core concept, it's just kind of a transitional idea that gets us to the next big idea. But any questions so far about this one? No, I'll leave that one out, to be fair to him. All right, I don't see any questions. So let's get into Marx's second big idea. Now, to remind you, the first big idea was material dialectic. The second big idea for Marx is this one, which is the labor theory of value. Now, I'm going to point out, he did not invent the labor theory of value, which a lot of Marxists seem to believe that. And it's fine, you can believe whatever you want. But I'll explain what this is. This is a core Marxist idea too. So this is a couple of questions. So first, what is the labor theory of value? Okay. First, it's qualitative value, aka what the value of labor should be. Now, if you don't know what qualitative means, qualitative is what people say we do in the humanities. That is, it's not strictly a numeric analysis, because look at here, right? We have the word should, which means it's a moral statement, right? So the labor theory of value first is what the value of labor ought to be or should be, right? Like what should labor be worth on like an ethical scale? This is the first part. The second part is the quantitative value, aka the mathematical value. This is what's the value of labor is needed for its production. So for a Marxist, they're focused on both of these things. Now, the labor theory of value is actually older than Marxism. For a little history, it comes from Catholic social teaching in like the 12th century. But it's the idea that in an ethical economy, up to 90% of the value of the product is labor. Therefore, 90% of the revenue of the product should go to the person who's inputting the labor. This is why, like, for example, if you know anything about Christian, like, taxes and things like that, a generally considered ethical tax is around 10%, and that's also the same for a tithe, aka the money you give to a church. Any more than that was considered to be unethical, because you're basically stealing the labor from the parishioners. And again, this makes a lot of sense in pre-industrial work. Let me give you an example. If I'm a blacksmith, it's my full-time job to make metal, and you give me raw iron, and then I turn raw iron into iron that's workable, and then into steel, and then I make a sword, right? That's almost all my physical labor, especially pre-industrial. So there's a qualitative value there, right? That I should get most of the value from my labor. Like, what if I made that sword and then the quote-unquote owner of my shop got like 90% of the profit and he pays me 10%? A labor theory of value person would say it's unethical, but they'd also say this one: the value of the labor needed for production isn't being compensated, right? If I did all the work to make the thing, I should get paid for this. All right. Now, This is a quote from the book, straight up. A man must work to produce his material life. So, for a Marxist, this is kind of the first ethical pillar of Marxism. Because a man must work to produce his material life, and then there's these qualitative and quantitative ways to measure it, there's this idea that a man should get the value of his labor that he puts into his work. And then here we get into more of it. Let me see. So now we talk about basically, let me find my notes here. Yeah, I had to skip ahead a little bit. Yeah, here we go. So, is there anything I'm missing? Nope, here we go. So then we just say, then there's this thing, we need to find a match for labor and needs for all central planning in socialist and primitive societies. So Marxists, we talked about before, tend to like primitive and socialist societies more. Why? Because they think that there's a fairer allocation, labor for value. So for example, in that small village I mentioned, or in like a hunter-gatherer society, everything is like centrally allocated, so it's more just. And again, this is a socialist argument for central planning in socialist societies. Now again, even this one, the socialist planning, he uses a euphemism, and I'll give it to you. The democratic selection of priorities by the mass of producer-consumers themselves. Do I have that here? I think I have that here. Yeah, here we go. The quote-unquote democratic selection of priorities by mass producers and consumers themselves. And also, a word note here I want to give you. Democratic, just like the word capitalism, democratic and capitalism are both Marxist euphemisms. They were not used before this, basically ever. And whenever you hear democratic selection of priorities or democratization, it means socialization, aka central planning a thing. Now, of course, like I said in the quote, right, they say by the mass of producer-consumers themselves. So for a socialist, right, this is a big deal. So they really think everybody should be a producer and a consumer, and they should pick how things are allocated. This is, when you hear the word democratic, this is actually what people mean. They mean Marxist democracy, which, again, that's kind of what the word democratic means, actually, to be fair to Marxists. So, all right, moving on. Now, this is interesting. Price fluctuations, and there's an argument here for price fluctuations and what this labor theory of value is. So, for a Marxist, basically, capitalism has a bunch of price fluctuations, and there is no price equilibrium. And the price, basically, can keep going up and down because for a Marxist they think that's the how the market's supposed to work. But if you asked a Marxist, if you got to a place where there's a perfect theory of labor value, then you have assuming you can have perfect humans, you could also have perfect prices, etc. And again, remember we talked about Marxist assumptions? This is one of their many assumptions they talk about. There's the idea that both we can perfectly know the theory of labor value, and in somehow there is a perfect nature of humans. Like we can somehow perfect human nature by understanding this science. I just want to point that out. And do I have this on here? Oh yeah. So now the reason we don't understand it according to a Marxist is we have to understand abstracted principles. And this is why Marx is not accountable for price fluctuations, because they're abstracted on a higher level. So that's why if Marx is wrong in the micro, he's still right in the macro for a Marxist. All right. Now, price fluctuations are labor theory asserting itself. So if you asked a Marxist, why do prices fluctuate? For them, it's not supply and demand. They think that's incorrect. A Marxist would say that there's basically deeper causes here. So, and what's the deeper cause? Well, it's all price fluctuations for Marxists are the labor theory of value asserting itself. So basically, underneath the capitalist system, there is there's this rule. It's not just a moral guideline for a Marxist. They think it's a rule of physical reality. And more correctly, a Marxist would say a rule of capitalist reality, that whenever prices are fluctuating, the labor theory of value is continually trying to reassert itself. Now, what are these kind of rules that we're going to talk about? Well, so these are the laws that they would say happen. So the first one is the theory of value, labor theory asserting itself first. It governs the exchange of relations between commodities. And for a Marxist, there is something like a magic center, aka a place where more workers are getting the value of worker they should get for their work. Next, there's this idea that it determines the relative proportions of the total social labor devoted to different commodities. So somehow, let's see, I'm checking my notes here. Yeah. So there's this one too. So, oh yeah, and this is why prices fluctuate, right? So, and the Magic Center, he's actually making fun of supply and demand market economists. So, and this one too, right? We're basically talking about how the relative proportions of the social labor devoted to different commodities is shifting. This is why prices would shift. And finally, he talks about the rules for economic growth. Now, what's this one? Basically, it's higher profit. And to quote the book, it actually says they're just stealing faster. And we'll get into that in a second. Now, oh, do I talk about this right now? Hold on. Boop. Oh yeah, we'll get into that. So, price fluctuations, so this is how it asserts itself, right? So, when market economists think there's basically a perfect, like, supply and demand is always fighting. So, like, for example, if the price is going up, it means there's more demand, less supply. If a price is going down, there's more demand, less supply. So to have a perfect magic center for a market economist, aka a capitalist economist, if you're a Marxist, is you have to have that perfect match. But they think this is just a misapplication of the labor theory of value. Same thing here, right? So when we'll talk about what social labor is in a second, but when social labor is devoted to different commodities, and unnaturally, that was what a Marxist would say, that also changes the price. And then when the economic growth is being pushed for profit, that can also distort prices, aka price gouging or something. All right. So now, we're going to get into this concept in the next stage. This is the third pillar, but he mentions it now. So, let me see. Marx versus classical labor theory. No. So surplus value is a word that we're going to use going forward. It's a very Marxist word. It's profit, rent, and interest. Now, if you don't know what profit is, right? Profit is literally just like, I bought an apple for $3, I sell it for $5, my profit would be $2, right? Because I made more money than I lost. Rent is any fixed asset that pays you money. So the easiest one to think of is literally apartments, right? I just own a hard asset, and then I get rents from it without me expending any labor. Now again, same thing with profit, right? Like think about like the owner of a supermarket. Is the owner of the supermarket expending a lot of labor? Like let's say he's an absentee owner, right? Perhaps not. Same thing with rent. If I'm an absentee landlord, I might not be using my labor to get rent. Same thing with interest, right? Interest is when I give you my money, or let's be honest, I make money out of nothing, and then I charge you for the pleasure of using my money. So none of these require labor, strictly from a Marxist standpoint, and they call all of these surplus value, and we'll talk about why in a second. Now this is interesting. So for a Marxist, they basically talk about social labor. Now, what is social labor? They think social labor is kind of like just labor theory of value labor, but they don't think it can be traded in a free exchange. In a free exchange, it's not social labor, and I'll explain why in a second, but the short version is social labor is literally using the labor theory of value to determine how every individual worker gets paid, aka social labor is a worker who does not have their surplus value taken. So, like, for example, we've made the joke in my class, right? But for each penny the state pays for each one of you in the seat, I do not get 90% of it. If I did, I'd be getting hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, right? So for Marxists, they would say, my labor isn't social labor because the surplus value of my labor is going to the university, not to me. Does that make sense? Or if you work at a restaurant, right? Most of the profit goes to the owner, not to the worker. So the surplus value is going in rent and profit, not to the workers. So you don't have social labor because you're not getting paid for it. All right. Now, there's a quote here I want to quote from the book. Yeah, there are some pretty good quotes here. Let me see. 44. Here we go. The labor theory of... This is on page 44, too, if you have it. The labor theory of value has nothing to do with the judgments on the usefulness of things from the point of view of human happiness or social progress. It has even less to do with establishing the conditions for justice in exchange. Oh, I got lost. It simply recognizes the deeper meaning of the actual act of exchange and the output of commodities under capitalism, and what governs the distribution of income between social classes, which results from these acts, independently of any moral, aesthetic, or political judgment. Indeed, if one were to look for such judgments, one would have to say that Marx, while understanding why the law of value has to operate as it does under the commodity production, did not strive to defend that law, but on the contrary, to build a society in which its operations would be totally abolished. So, basically, for a Marxist, labor theory has nothing to do with judgments. They think it's just describing reality. Now, the critique here would be something like, the value comes from demand, and Marxists say value comes from labor inputs alone, and then anything else is a distortion or a lie. Now, why would I say that? Well, he points it out in his thing a little bit, but let me give you an example. What if you put your labor into a product no one wants to buy? Or nobody has any use for? The best example I've heard of from a libertarian, actually, but it's an interesting one. Like, what if I just move rocks in a field? Right? I'm exerting labor, but I can't demand that anybody pays me for the labor I'm doing. So that's kind of the critique of it, but Marxists would say that's irrelevant. So just pointing that out. All right, any questions so far about labor theory of value? What is it? And this is one of the big three. So if you have any problems with this or the material dialectic, I would definitely recommend asking a question. Somebody asks, so labor needs to be relevant. For a market economist, so we'll call them a classic economist. For a classic economist, they would say, yes, the labor still needs to be relevant. But a Marxist would say, not necessarily, but it's more like, who would pick irrelevant work? That's kind of the Marxist counter, to be fair to them. It'd be like, why would you do incompetent work, right? Workers aren't that dumb, right? They know they need to, like, do a job that people will pay for. So for a Marxist, that would be a straw man, and for a capitalist, they'd call him a capitalist. But for a classical economist, they think it's a critical hit. To use video game jokes. I'm sure everybody's played a Dragon Quest game or something. Any other questions? Good. At least one person liked my my Japan game joke. Great. All right. So let's keep going. And I already lost my slide. There we go. All right. So that's the second. I'm glad people like it. My Dragon Quest joke. I just had to play through the new one. Yeah. I say had to, but it's not that bad. My wife loves it, but she just wants to watch it play and doesn't actually want to play it. Okay, now the third pillar, not on the Switch. I'm a PC Master Race kind of guy. All right, everybody. So the third pillar of, if you play Nintendo, it's great. I just don't have one right now. And apparently they cost like $1,000 because of the quarantine, which is hilarious. Oh, all right. So now, the third pillar of Marxist thought, the theory of surplus value. This is going to be the big one. So, okay. So, by the way, you need all three of these together to be, let's say, genuinely Marxist. And to give you how much Professor Mandel thinks this matters, his subheading for this is Marx's key discovery, his theory of surplus value. So this is what kind of separates Marx from just diagnosing to critiquing. Because the first two are just, one is a Catholic classic idea, and the second one is just materialism. We've had materialism since literally Roman times. There's Roman materialists. We'll get into it. But now we have Marx's theory of surplus value. And this is his key it should be discovery. I'm going to check my own spelling. So Marx's key discovery, according to Mandel, this is the foundational pillar of Marx. And it's also where Marx gets his biggest attacks. So the fundamental idea here of the theory of surplus value is, from a Marxist perspective, profit itself is stolen from labor. If you've ever heard like profit is theft or why companies shouldn't make money, from a Marxist perspective, there is no profit independent of it being stolen from labor. And to say this, let me see. So, and there's an idea here too that even all pre-capitalist income and consumption of ruling classes is appropriation. Now, again, that if you've ever heard appropriation, appropriation is a Marxist word. This is where we get it. So, for pre-Marxists, it's appropriation. And they also, there's a quote from it too. Quote, no economic exchange at all, unquote. So it's all appropriation, not exchange, pre-capitalist. And then post-capitalist, all profit is stolen from labor. It is not a voluntary transaction. And he points out here a quote from his book too, slaves are good profit, right? Because what's a slave? A slave is someone who has 100% of their labor stolen. Oh, and a key thing I forgot, I should go back really quick. And under this one, by the way, the labor theory of value also asserts, and even some liberals asserted this, the idea that one natural right is 100% ownership to your own labor. Now, interestingly enough, there's a guy called John Locke who is decently influential in the foundation of the United States. John Locke believes the most important property, if you remember the Constitution, right, like life, liberty, and life, liberty, and happiness. The most important, happiness means property, by the way. The most important property is your own labor. So owning your labor is the most important property. So even John Locke believed basically in the labor theory of value. Just something interesting to think about. All right. So getting in here. So yeah, all pre-capitalist income and consumption of ruling classes is appropriation. So for a Marxist, even before capitalism, now if you remember from the first week, every system has kind of its own rules, so Marxists say capitalist rules don't work the same as feudal rules. And in this class, for those of you who weren't there, we spent 8 weeks talking about Japanese feudalism. So for that system, all of the consumption and income of the working classes is appropriation too. Alright, now capitalism is worse than feudalism for a Marxist. Why? Because being a wage laborer, you have less control of production compared to an artisan or a farmer. Now again, we talked about the Tokugawa, right? For a Marxist, they'd prefer the Tokugawa because, if you remember, farmers, or either tenant farmers or even more, own their own land, which means they're connected to the means of their production. So they own the way they make their living. Because think about it right now, right? If you work at a Starbucks, you don't own any of the means of production. You don't own the beans, you don't own the distribution network, you don't own the espresso machine. Only thing you own is your labor, that's it. So you have less leverage than a person in a feudal society. Same thing with an artisan, right? Like if you were a weaver, like someone who made clothing, in feudal times, you controlled your machine almost all the time. So you had the loom, you hand weaved, so you had kind of the right to your machines, which means you kind of kept more of your own labor, which means less of your labor was stolen as quote-unquote profit. So capitalism's worse because you don't control the production as much as you would have in the feudal times. And then this is where we get these exploitation terminologies. So let's get into it here. So here we go. Yeah. So exploitation between labor and capital because of institutional inequality. Now, if you've ever heard of institutional inequality, again, this is we talked about equality and inequality with liberalism, but when you get ideas of like exploitation and institutional inequality, these are very much Marxist terminologies. So for a Marxist, there's a fundamental inequality between labor and capital, and this is why it's exploitation. Now, what would a market person say, right? A market person would say, you have the choice of whom to work for. And I think I have this here. Oh, yeah. A Marxist disagrees, though. A Marxist doesn't think that's true. Why? Owner is not forced to buy his labor, right? Actually, they would say it's the other way around. So, like, for example, owner can close his factory and fire everyone, hire scabs, right? So, and do I have this here? Oh, I do. For a Marxist, they believe labor, aka people selling their owned labor, right? You own your labor under classical, like Catholic and both Catholic and Marxist theory. But for them, you're under economic, for them being a Marxist, Marxists believe you're under an economic compulsion to sell your labor. You do not have a choice in a Marxist standpoint because you must work to feed your family or feed yourself, right? You're under a compulsion to sell to someone. There is not an unlimited number of people to sell to. And, right, you have a limited status set. I mean, even me, right? I'm a professor. I don't actually have an unlimited market for my labor from a Marxist standpoint. Because there's only so many places I can go, right? So, like, if all the universities decide to have certain standards, I can't, like, end around them very easily. So, in some ways, they would say I'm compelled to sell. And do I have this on here? Oh, yeah. In addition, you have no access to the means of production. And the technical word for this is capital goods. So capital goods means the things that require investment for you to do your jobs. For example, like I said, the barista with the barista machine, or a farmer with the farmland and the cattle, or the tractor and the buildings you would need, or a factory worker that needs the factory itself, like the physical factory and the manufacturing in the factory, right? So if the less you have access to capital goods, the more you're compelled to sell. Now, this is interesting, actually. A Marxist escape from this, where did I put this? Here we go. Free land is an escape from this profit trap. So, for example, Marxists tend to not be fans of colonialism, but they did think that, like, for example, in North and South America, the development of land, but especially North America, the development of undeveloped land that was basically given away for free, this, for a Marxist, was great ethically, because one would get all their own surplus value. So you would just move to empty land, right? And then you develop it, and then you get all the profit from the land. For Marxists, this is very ethical, and they liked that. But in general, workers do not own the means of their production. So, like, for example, it's really weird right now. You could argue right now, me teaching this class, from a Marxist point of view, I own my means of production, right? I'm using my computer and my microphone with all publicly available software. The issue is, of course, I don't own any of the university infrastructure. That's what they would say I'm lacking. So, like I said, free land is the escape from this. So one of the kind of outlets of capitalism, like for a Marxist, is free land is a way out of this trap. So if you can get free access to land, then you're safe. Spoiler, we can still homestead in the United States. You can work at, under English common law, which has been under attack for 100 years. If you work something for like 8 to 10 years, you own it. Because unworked land, you don't have a right to own unworked land under English common law. So if I just have abandoned land and somebody else works it, I can get rights to the land. This is also a very interesting law nobody wants to talk about anymore. All right. Now, colonialism is also part of this dynamic for a Marxist. Let me find my... Oh, yeah. So colonialism is also part of this dynamic. Why? Because you're basically... Let me find my quote on 48. He says here, okay, without such institutional compulsion, a fully developed capitalist society would be impossible. Indeed, once a compulsion is absent, for example, where large tracts of free land subsist, capitalism will remain dwarfed until, by hook or by crook, the bourgeoisie class suppresses access to that free land. The last chapter of Capital Volume 1 on colonialization develops this point to great effect. The history of Africa, especially South Africa, but also Portuguese, Belgium, French, and British colonies, strikingly confirm this analysis. And he says, quote, 41, this is his footnote on page 48, we refer here to a large-scale appropriation of land by white settlers and colonial companies, herding together Africans to reserves, the imposition of money taxes in essentially non-monetary economies, forcing the Africans to sell their labor power in order to get necessary money to pay taxes. The imposition of large-scale money fines, or even direct forced labor penalties for innumerable transgressions of laws specifically designed to furnish the settlers with labor power, etc. If people are living under conditions where there is no economic compulsion to sell their labor power, then repressive judicial and political compulsion has to deliver the necessary manpower to the entrepreneurs. Otherwise, capitalism could not survive under these circumstances. Wow. So basically, for Marxists, this is all part of that forced labor dynamic, right? You're basically compelling new groups of people to sell you their labor. And again, if there's not economic compulsion, like there's too much economic freedom, Marxists believe that you use judicial and political compulsion to force people to sell their labor. Like they said, forced laws of, like forced fees, forced fines, forced political be taxes, right? You force people who were previously untaxed into taxes. And then this forces people to work, which, right, they're then forced to work to then sell their labor to pay the taxes they didn't have to pay before. And again, even if you like taxes, even if you don't like Marxism, you can understand some of their critiques might be decent critiques, right? Taxes are one thing to compel you to work. It's interesting. All right. Now, this is interesting too. For a Marxist, land ownership itself is a trap, because the land itself causes inequalities, because there's one person who owns their labor and owns their land, and there's one person who doesn't. Bam, we have a Marxist inequality. And why would we care about this? And because there's a weird thing here, like no inequality existed before 150 years ago, while a Marxist would say they had access to their means of production. So even though there was feudal inequality, it's different because at least you could make your own thing. So you might be poor, but you at least controlled your labor, which was better than being like poor and not controlling your labor. Do I have this on here? Oh yeah, and a quote here, it's interesting. Quote, "The separation of labor from the means of production was a long and bloody historical process," unquote. And I'm just reading my notes really quick. Let's see. Yes, and for a Marxist, right, this is the core of Marxism here. So the surplus theory of value is the origin and content of the class struggle. Again, if you've never heard of the class struggle, or you have, this is also Marxism. Now, Marxists love to pretend that class didn't exist before Marx. Spoiler, I am a Greek and Roman historian. The Greeks and Romans knew class exist, and they knew class struggle existed. But for a Marxist, there's a specific, this is their way they'd escape my critique, for example, as a classicist. They would say the way they escape is the rules of capitalist theory surplus value only applies to capitalism. So it doesn't apply to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. That's how they'd escape the trap. But for them, this basically profit being stolen from labor is the core of class struggle for all of capitalist economies. It's basically the people who take labor and the people who get it. That's the competition. So any question, that's why, for example, you can have like a socialist professor, and it's not inconsistent for a professor to be a Marxist and be in solidarity with a factory worker, because they're both hypothetically having their labor stolen. Although mine's being stolen by the state, so that's slightly more ethical for a Marxist. But anyway, any questions about this so far? Comments too, comments are fine. Questions, comments. And I need more tea. Most people are just like, what the heck are we talking about? My gosh. Hopefully we got it. You can be real. I accept. Okay, so there's two comments. I'll read the first comment. Someone said, I'm going to have to rewatch this all. Great. I'd actually recommend, don't rewatch it first. I would recommend take a look at the Capital introduction, especially the ones where I said it's the big three pillars. And Mandel really clearly, he has great subheadings, and I'd actually recommend doing this in your paper. Look for the ones that are specifically theory of surplus value, Where's the Materialist Dialectic? There's the Marxist labor theory of value, and I'm looking for the dialectical one. I think it's under Method of Capital, perhaps, where he talks about the Materialist Dialectic. So, like, read it and then watch it again. That's what I'd recommend. And somebody asks, wait, so what are the distinctive classes and the types of Marxists? Okay, the distinctive classes are generally called bourgeoisie and proletariat. But what does that mean? Well, proletariat is anyone who works with their labor. That's what a proletariat is. So your labor is your commodity. A bourgeoisie is people who benefit, they profit from the labor of others. That is the Marxist class distinction. That's it. So if you profit from the labor of others, you're a bourgeoisie or a capitalist. And if you profit from your own labor, then you're a proletariat. So that's why, like, you can have proletariat professors. It doesn't make sense from a market point of view, like the classical economics, but from a Marxist economics, it makes sense. All right. And if you have more questions, you can totally ask me as I go. All right. And we've got... Do we have time for this slide? I think we can do it. Let me just double check. Boop. No, method. No, beep. And that. And this. And then we'll be almost done, huh? Okay, cool. Great. Okay. So one last point before we go, we're done for today. So talking about, if you remember, I said both democracy and democratization are Marxist terminologies, but so is capital and capitalism. Now, the book is called Das Kapital, or Capital. So that's the foundation of this book's idea. Capital as an idea comes from classical economics. And Marx was a student of Hegel, but also Adam Smith. Adam Smith is the father of modern economics. So he read Adam Smith and Ricardo. So he's well-versed in economics and philosophy. So he learned German philosophy and British philosophy, and he learned British economics, basically. So what's Marx's theory of capital? Now, so I'll give it to you. So capital, from a Marxist point of view, is the social relational between men, which appears as a relation between things and between men and things. Now, if that doesn't make a lot of sense, I will try to explain. Well, okay. That is the quote from the book here, and I'm going to explain it, actually, to make it make more sense. Where did I go? I went 5 to 6. Oh, here we go. Yeah, I got to flip it over. So, do I have it on here? Oh, yeah. So, for a Marxist, this builds, quote-unquote, rationally from the previous two theories. Now, let me explain what this means. Only capital. What is capital? How do we get to it? Well, capital in traditional theory is just money for investment. Let me say that again. Capital in traditional economic theory is extra money you have that you can then invest in business. That's the number one way. We now think of investment in stock. Stock is just owning parts of a company, which is like investment. But capital is extra liquid money you have to then invest in a business. That's what capital is traditionally. But for a Marxist, it's more complicated than that. Because if you remember, profit itself is stolen from labor. So how do I get liquid cash? Either from my own labor, or from going to a farm homestead, or from getting profit from labor. AKA, that's capital. So, okay. So this is why we get this social relation between men, which appears in relation between things and men and things. So basically, capital isn't free of the way I got capital. So almost all capital for a Marxist is derived from surplus value. And so this is naturally from the labor theory of value and surplus value. So basically, it means I had to get capital by stealing from someone, right? So only capital, and capital is only when goods are sold as commodities, and not being consumed by the group that makes them. This is a differentiation from many Marxists. So for example, if my little village if I'm a shoemaker in a small village, and I sell my own labor and make money to live my life, that is not capital for a Marxist. That's just money. Because it's more just, right? Like I own my money. But it's only capital when it's sold as commodity. So if I have a giant factory where I make those million shoes, and I'm the owner, and I sell the shoes for a profit, and I pay you a salary, that is now capital. And again, for a Marxist, to recapitulate, I'm selling that labor for a profit, which means I'm taking your labor. So keep that in mind. Now, for a Marxist, and this is an interesting observation, money is also a commodity, right? I can make profit off of money. And he's saying Adam Smith and Schumpeter are wrong, which takes big cojones, but they're classical economists that Marx doesn't like. So just pointing that out. All right. Now, this is basically why when Marxists start to get really, we'll say, mad. So here we go. So capitalism, I'll quote and then I'll explain. Capitalism is the system where capital is used to seize the means of production. Now, what does seize mean? Seize means to steal with force. That's what seize means, right? When the police seize your assets, the government takes your stuff and sells it, or uses it, right? So for a Marxist, capitalism is a system where capital, aka this extra labor you take from other people, you then use it to basically steal with force the means of production. Now, what's the assumption here? Well, I have a question I ask. How can the means be seized? Well, it's the idea that in the idyllic past, means were owned by everyone. So in the savage, right, in commune, and then in feudal times, it's owned by you. And then this is actually a reflection of the noble savage from Rousseau, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So firms only have profit motives. So aka if profit is seizing and stealing, it's a negative. So basically capitalism as a system, and again, capitalism is a Marxist word, it's not a classical economics word. Capitalism is a system where you use capital to steal the means of production from people. And then this is how it starts. Basically, it starts as rent collecting, aka I charge you to use my thing. But eventually, it expropriates machinery from producers. So the system develops when a system that starts as just rent, I eventually get the machinery from the producers. So for the foundation of the Marxists, one reason they're okay with revolutionary stealing things back, in Marxist ethics, they think that not only has your labor been stolen, but the machinery itself has been stolen from the workers. This is what Marxists truly believe. So, and again, private ownership is a strategy for private capital accumulation. So they don't think private ownership is right. They don't think private ownership is just. They actually see it as just extraction. And let me see. Is there anything else I'm reading here? Okay, yeah. And where is this? Okay, we're still up here. Okay, so next. Even judicial reality only reflects socioeconomic reality. Oh, another fun Marxist word. Socioeconomic is also only a Marxist word. Everybody uses it now, but it's really just a Marxist thing. So, so they point out here, judicial reality itself is also just, let me see. I'm reading my notes, one second. So what this means is, like, for example, a Marxist would say, courts can't be any more fair than our means of production. What would they mean, right? Well, one with more capital automatically is probably going to do better in courts, but they probably also own the politicians and can make the laws work better for them, etc. So there isn't actually judicial reality for a Marxist that's free of the material, how we make our money reality. So they don't see a difference here, right? Judicial reality is socioeconomic reality. And what's socioeconomic reality? It's those previous 3 points. It's the material dialectic, it's surplus value, and it's labor theory. So in a capitalist system, the courts itself, for a Marxist, are impacted by how we make our living. So obviously a capitalist will do better in a court than a person fighting for their labor. Now, what's the content of the economic institution of capitalist reality? It's the independent firm. Would it shock you that they don't like independent firms? So, and let's see. And they hate independent firms, basically, right? Because an independent firm for a Marxist is just another way to seize the machinery from the workers and get more profit, which is just seizing your labor. All right. Now, there's a problem for Marx here, which he admits, Mandel admits. Decisions are not made by society as a whole. So they talk a lot, Marxists love to talk about democratization, but literally workers don't have enough time to make all these choices, right? So they have to be centrally planned, which means you quote-unquote democratize it, and you pick someone to make these choices for you, right? This is why they love quote-unquote democracy. Now there's a problem here. You're picking people who are then able to understand something called because they're democratizationally picked, they can somehow understand what you need. So this is two more Hegelian ideas that sneak in, and these are good to understand. Now, these are not in the book, and a Marxist probably would appreciate what I'm explaining. These two they will not appreciate. But let me explain what these ideas are. First, and we'll stop here for today, we're basically out of time. The general will, and I'll start here again just so we can get clarity, but the general will idea is this idea that, like, if you understand good theory, so for Hegelian, that would mean understanding Hegel's dialectic. But for a Marxist, it means if you understand all of this I just explained, you can, like, almost, they would say scientifically, but a non-Marxist would say almost spiritually understand what people need and want, so you can make the correct decisions. Because society can't make them for itself, if you understand Marxist theory, suddenly you understand the will of the people, basically, the general will. And then you can make good decisions because you understand all this economic theory. And the same thing, freedom here, this is a great one. Freedom in Marxism means is Hegelian freedom. If you don't know what Hegelian freedom is, it's the freedom to follow the general will. So when a Marxist says democratization and freedom, they mean you're free to follow the will of the mass of the proletariat. How do you know the mass of the proletariat? Do you poll them? No. You know Marxist theory. And if that seems a little off topic or a little interesting, welcome to Marxist theory, everybody. And we're going to stop here for today. I will start here on freedom and general will, a little bit more Hegel too, when we come back. If you got any questions, now is the time for questions. And I'm debating if we need... Nah, we don't need it. We're not going to do the journal right now. I don't feel like it. So, and also next class, I'm going to put up the draft guidelines. Please take a look at those. So, besides that, we're definitely done. If you have any bonus questions, now's the time to ask. And if you don't, please bring them to the beginning of next week, where we will talk more about writing, and then we'll finish off Marx. And I will upload the drafts by the end of class. So if there's no more questions, I'm waiting a couple seconds. But if you have a question, now's the time to ask. If there's no more questions or comments, we'll be free. We'll finish up Capital's intro next class. And I'll give it a second. Somebody's typing something. And if you don't have a question, you're totally free, by the way. After this question, I'll end it. Nope. Okay. The question disappeared into the ether. If I see it, I'll answer it at the beginning of next time. So besides that, folks, be free. Thanks for being here for my second Marx lecture. Yes, it's complicated. This is one reason people don't like to read it. But I'd recommend read the intro and then watch it again and then bring questions the next time. I'm happy to answer anything that didn't make sense. These are kind of the cores. So if you don't understand these, using and understanding Marxism is kind of hard. But once you get them, it's kind of like you get over the hump, and then their theories make a lot more sense. All right, thanks for showing up, everybody. I will see you all next Thursday, or this coming Thursday. Have a good day.